Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our September Town Hall meeting for Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition. I'm Father George Williams, and our topic today is immigration ministry on the border. And our speaker is Brother Jesuit, Father Brian Strassburger. He's down in Brownsville, Texas, and Karen Clifton, our executive coordinator at CPMC, and I had a chance to spend a few days with them earlier in the summer, visiting in their work and taking part in their ministry. So it was extremely moving and inspiring to see what you've been doing there, Brian, and welcome. I appreciate you taking the time to share with us today about what's going on there and what you're doing. For those of you who are joining us live, if you have any questions for Father Brian, please write them in the chat feature of your and then I can let him know what the questions are. A special shout out to Sister Karen. The guys at San Quentin send their love. Good to see you. And so, Brian, welcome. Great to have you with us.
Great. Thank you, George. I appreciate the invitation. Great to be with you all. I see a couple of familiar faces who are joining in this call who have been down and visited the border as well. So Deacon David Billing and Lisa Neuhauser being two of them who have been down and visited us and joined us in our ministry. So good to be with you all. As George said, my name is Father Brian Strassburger. I'm a Jesuit priest. I'm the director of Del Camino Jesuit Border Ministries. It's a project based out of the Diocese of Brownsville, Texas, serving on the U.S. Mexico border in the south of Texas and in the north of Tamaulipas, Mexico. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to share my screen in just a moment here and go through a little bit of a presentation, kind of introducing the origins of our ministry, talking a little bit about the border reality and what that has invited and called out of us as a team of Jesuits here serving on the border, and share a couple of stories as well of some people we've met and encountered in our ministry. And as was mentioned, if you want to put any questions in the chat, you're welcome to do so. And we'll try to address those questions either as we go or at the end as I kind of finish with part of the presentation. So again, it's my pleasure to be with you and glad to be able to share from my experience working on the border. So I'm going to pull up the presentation now. So I'd like to provide a little bit of an Ignatian look at the U.S. Mexico border. So looking at it from a Catholic, even Ignatian lens. And so part of that means engaging the senses and thinking about what the reality is and what it looks like. And so I was first sent here about 3 years ago when I was first ordained a priest in 2021. And a good way to start when you get sent as a new priest to a new place is to meet with the local bishop. And so we met with Bishop Daniel Flores, who's the bishop here in the Diocese of Brownsville, Texas. And he, in that first meeting, really, I think, gave us the charge that's continued to motivate our ministry from that day going forward. And he told us, what I'd like you to do is to read the reality and respond to it. So we were a team of 3 Jesuits just arriving on the border, and he didn't task us with running one of his parishes, with opening a great Jesuit institution like a high school or a university. He said, read the reality and respond to it. And so I want to speak briefly about what reality is that we've seen and how we've analyzed the response to it and informed our own response. So what is the reality that we encounter on the U.S. Mexico border? We're located in the Rio Grande Valley, which is the easternmost part of a 2,000-mile border. It's a very long border. It is the most frequently crossed international border in the entire world for the number of legal crossings that happen every single year. Living in a border community like Brownsville, I see how frequent it is that people are traveling across the border to visit with family, to go shopping, to get dental work done. For any number of reasons, people cross the border on a regular basis. There are about 330 ports of entry located along that 2,000-mile border, and the RGV, the Rio Grande Valley, is the easternmost part of it. About half the border, the western half of the border, is basically a line drawn in the sand, or in many places, a wall built on the earth. And then starting in El Paso, going down to where we are, the Rio Grande Valley descends from Colorado and New Mexico and forms the border between the two countries, with Texas on the north side of the Rio Grande River and Mexico to the south of it. And so it becomes a river border where the ports of entry become actual bridges, and the midway point of the river marks the boundary between our countries. In our area, we've got a pair of twin cities, Brownsville on the U.S. side, with Matamoros on the Mexican side, Reynosa McAllen on the U.S. side, about an hour to the west of us, and Reynosa on the Mexican side of that. If you take those four city populations combined together, it's around the same population as El Paso Juarez, making it kind of the second or third largest border population area of the border after Tijuana and San Diego, which on the western side, which is the largest. Speaking about the reality, we have to talk not just about the migrant reality, but also about the reality of poverty in our area. Brownsville is consistently ranked on the lists of poorest cities in the United States of America, based on a number of different factors in terms of income and poverty line, education rates, diabetes, health metrics, and things like that. But it's also an extremely Catholic part of the country. Texas is not a state known for having a large Catholic population historically, but the Diocese of Brownsville has over 1 million Catholics that make up about 85% of the population. But with only around 70 or so priests serving the diocese, it makes it among the lowest rates of priest per Catholic in the entire country. So an extremely Catholic place, but a very underserved Catholic population because of the lack of priests serving in the diocese. Just to give a little snapshot of what the area is, I used to think Houston was the south of Texas before I moved to the state. I grew up in Denver, Colorado. But if you look at the inset on the top right, you can see how big of a state Texas is and how far we are away from Houston and San Antonio, Austin, and of course, Dallas, located in the northern part of the state. We're talking about the very bottom of the state of Texas. And you can kind of see a little bit of a snapshot of the area. San Felipe is the parish we live near. Casa Miguel Pro is the name of our community. Pumarejo shelters in Matamoros on the other side of the river. And then looking to the west, the humanitarian respite centers in McAllen. And then there's a couple of shelters in Reynosa that I'm going to speak about momentarily. So that just gives you a general lay of the land, more or less, about the area I'm speaking about. We're going to read the reality. We got to talk also about the migrant reality. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide, but if more questions come up, I can revisit it. And so the bottom line of this slide, what I want to say is that a line I sometimes hear when it comes to the border and migration is, I'm not against migration. I just want people to get in line. And the one point I want to make here is that for many, many people, especially if you're a poor migrant coming from Central America, and you've been threatened by cartel violence in the place where you live and fear for your life or otherwise, something happening here. Then there is no line essentially for you to get in. None of the main legal pathways the United States permits for entrance into the country are available to you. And so what that leads to is people trying to find avenues to seek protection in a place like the United States, where they often even have family and friends and contacts, or are seeking opportunity in a better life. And so people are looking for any kind of legal pathways to do so. But in many cases, there's no line, as I said, for someone just to get in. So I just want to emphasize that the U.S.-Mexico border is not an open border, despite what any politician might say to you. There are a lot of ways in which it is regulated, patrolled, and policed, preventing people from getting in. The main avenue that the U.S. Has created for migrants coming to seek protection in the U.S. to use is a smartphone app called CBP One, which you download on your smartphone, and then you create an account, you send in some advanced information, and you ask for an appointment every day. And a percentage of those appointments are given out in a random lottery, so you could get it any day, and the others are given to people who've been in the system the longest. The average wait time is supposedly 2 to 3 months, but the longest wait time we've seen has been up to 7 months for non-Mexican nationals and up to 10 months for Mexican nationals. If you enter with the CBP One app, you're not a citizen of the United States, you don't have any permanent protection, you're granted a 2-year temporary parole in the country, but you're eligible to apply for a work visa for those 2 years, and you can seek asylum if you're seeking more long-term protection in the country. There's a new asylum ban that's been in place for those who enter between ports of entry. So if you don't opt for the CBP One app, if you cross a river or enter into the desert and wave your hands and try to flag down a CBP officer and say, hey, look, I've entered the country. I know I didn't do it right, but I'm doing it because I'm fleeing violence. I'm really afraid for my life. I've come to seek protection. Unfortunately, since May of 2023, the current administration has said you are ineligible to seek protection in that way. You're presumed ineligible. And so we might release you into the country, or we might just deport you and, in fact, give you a 5-year ban from even re-entering the United States legally. And we've seen more increased use of various forms of expedited removal, basically programs that the U.S. government tracks based on their success being measured by how quickly a migrant is deported from our country, including things like FIRM, the Family Expedited Removal Management, where a family member gets an ankle bracelet strapped to their ankle that they have to wear around in a very humiliating fashion, marking them as criminal in some way, and have to follow their ICE check-ins before they get screened and potentially deported back to their home country. So again, not an open border. But what's a result of this reality? The reality is that people seeking protection coming from all over the world, but especially from the Americas, are stuck in Mexico waiting for the smartphone app, trying to do things the right way, living in camps and shelters for months at a time, under-resourced camps and shelters, trying to seek relief. And we see that both in Reynosa, where we also see a larger Haitian population, but also Central Americans spread out over about 6+ shelters. And then we also see it in Matamoros, closer to Brownsville, where it's a largely Venezuelan population, although they're from Haiti and Mexico and Honduras, spread over a fewer number of shelters and camps, even though there are more appointments available for CBP-1 a day. The number of CBP-1 appointments available at the 8 ports of entry that have CBP-1 appointments is not based on the migrant populations there. It's based on the capacity of Border Patrol at the bridge. And so that's what kind of puts limitations of where migrants can be processed. So you see shelters like Senda de Vida, which is run by an evangelical pastor in Reynosa, Mexico. At one point there, we saw a group of Russian migrants fleeing the violence happening in Russia with their disagreements, especially with the president, President Putin. Fled the country and found themselves in Reynosa, Mexico. You also see pictures from Senda 2, another shelter. That photo was taken about a year ago, so there's not as many people at that shelter as there are in that photo, but you can see at some points people are sleeping on the ground underneath a large tent. I mean, in very, very poor conditions. You also have Casa del Migrante, a shelter run by the Catholic Church in Reynosa, staffed by the Daughters of Charity. The Rio camp is now basically empty, I'm happy to say, because it had some of the worst conditions I've ever seen. Really just one porta potty for people to use. So there was a field that was being used for open defecation because there's just a lack of resources. It was in a really sad state, but thankfully, as of right now, it's currently empty. There was a camp in Matamoros that had up to 1,000 people at one point. It's mostly been cleared out except for a few dozen people. Most people are staying at the Pumarejo shelter, although there are some other shelters as well. And in shelters like that, people are living in tents, using porta potties, asking for a smartphone appointment daily, eating what little food they offer, usually rice and beans and maybe a tortilla or piece of bread, something like that, as their meals. And then on the U.S. side of the border, there are some shelters or processing centers, like the Humanitarian Respite Center run by Catholic Charities. Sister Norma Pimentel is the executive director of that organization. So the centers on the U.S. side tend to be more centers of transit. Most migrants coming to the United States are not planning to live on a border community. They're dispersing throughout the country to go where they have family and friends and contacts, where they know they can get work and a place to live. That can include cities that have been big destinations recently for migrants, like New York or Chicago, but that Boston, Denver, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. But it can also be cities just spread out through the country where people know people in Tennessee or Wisconsin or Utah, North Carolina, Alabama, etc. So where they have contacts, where they feel like there's a safe place for them to live and look for work. So when they stay in the shelters on the U.S. side, they're usually there for 24 to 48 hours as they arrange their transportation to move further along. There are some demographic issues that we can note in the population we see of migrants, principally the Haitians who come through. Their first language is Haitian Creole and sometimes French as well, which is often taught in schools in Haiti. And then for both race and for language, they're often the victims of more discrimination on the migrant journey and along the border. So we see that as a reality. Sometimes there are just demographic challenges with language, whether it's migrants coming from China or from Russia, as I mentioned, or indigenous communities where Spanish is not the native language, even if they're coming from Guatemala or southern Mexico or otherwise. So that's part of the reality for us to be attentive to. So if that's a reality, the next thing I'd like to do is transition into talking about what a response could look like. So who is responding? How are they responding? And how are we then, as this Jesuit team serving on the border, called to respond? So one might think that the government would be responding to this, but we find that there's limited humanitarian support for the U.S. or Mexican government. There actually has been some more support from the U.S. government to shelters and centers and cities on the US side. It's been in the news recently. Maybe you've seen it on the news because FEMA, that handles emergency funding, has been funding, helping to provide some resources to city to provide more welcome to migrants coming in. And that's become under attack as we've had Hurricane Helene and we've got Milton coming. And so I just want to highlight the fact that the funding to help migrants is coming from the annual budget, but when there are big tragedies, there are allocations that come from Congress that are irrespective of the annual budget of FEMA. And so it's not as though the administration is choosing to fund to support migrants at the expense of American citizens suffering from hurricanes and tragedies. So just want to dispel the rumors you may have heard recently around language of that type. But oftentimes the government mostly invests not in welcome, but in expulsion and rejection and repelling migrants. So Governor Abbott of my state of Texas instituted Operation Lone Star, which has spent over $11 billion, mostly putting up more barriers along the border and using National Guard to patrol the border and to try to arrest and police migrants as though they are criminals. Even the Wall Street Journal said that Operation Lone Star has had little effect on migration, but has led to charges of civil rights abuses, like the sharp razor wire being placed underwater in the Rio Grande River and leading to severe injuries, including for women and children. So, a lot of money gets invested on the border, but very little of it is responding to the humanitarian needs of people who are coming to the country. New York City's Mayor Adams about a year ago said that this migrant crisis, quote unquote, will destroy New York City. I always get concerned when I hear even a phrase like migrant crisis. Migration really isn't a crisis. It's a very human thing. I mean, I moved to 5 cities in my first 10 years. Unless any of you are tuning into this call from sub-Saharan Africa, I think we can say that migration has been a human movement from the beginning of our species. And so movement is very normal. I don't think migration is a crisis. Migration is a very human thing. The crisis that I see is a humanitarian one built out of the divisions and the infrastructure of exclusion that we have invested so substantially in, as opposed to infrastructure of welcome facilitating transit. Okay, so the government's not responding very well. What about the media? Well, what I see in the media is a lot of phrases and words that get thrown around that I think are unhelpful to describing the reality. Things like crisis, as I talked about. Illegal migrants. There are people who enter the country illegally. That is to say, they cross a border between a port of entry. But most of that population actually waits at the border to present themselves to Border Patrol. And so if you find them elsewhere in the country, it's because they've been processed, released, and given paperwork to legally be into the country as their immigration process plays out. So they might have entered illegally, but to continue to call them illegal migrants is a bit of a misnomer because they have been processed and remain legally in the country as they follow through their process. Talking about numbers get thrown out a lot, record highs last year for migration and things like that I don't think provide a real perspective or get to the human level. Even at a record high last year, we had about 2.5 million people enter the country on the southern border. We also expelled about 1.5 million people from the country. So it was really only a net gain of about 1 million, which again, still is a very large number. But I might remind us that we're a country of 330 million people in the United States of America. So it's basically the equivalent of if I had a Jesuit high school with 1,000 kids at it, is if we got 3 new students. And 3 new students a year, I think, if your locker is right next to those 3 students, it might be really noticeable. But I don't think it's the kind of thing that's changing the entire culture of the school. So even the numbers that get thrown around often aren't thrown around with any sort of perspective. I'm particularly bothered when I hear the word about an invasion happening on the southern border. When I hear that, I'm often invited to peer out my window and see the signs of an invasion. But when I don't see people crowding around the street or bombs blowing up the buildings around us, I'm kind of insulted that we use invasion when I think about the violence happening in other parts of our world today. The media also tends to focus on tragedies, whether it's migrants dying in the back of a trailer in San Antonio or Americans being kidnapped in northern Mexico, or other stories that they focus on are the ones that grab more attention, get more likes and clicks. And so that's what they focus on instead of zeroing in on the real day-to-day human experience of a migrant waiting for an appointment while sleeping in a tent for 6 months. It's just not the kind of thing that is a great story or narrative that our media is really going to focus in on. So who is responding? Well, who is responding are really NGOs, the nonprofits in the area. I just offer a little list there. a photo of Sister Norma Pimentel, who's one of the heroes, of course, in the Catholic Church for border and immigration, being advocates for migrants. Just a list of the different NGOs that are doing exceptional work on both sides of the border, trying to meet the needs of the humanitarian crisis that we see on the border for migrants who are seeking protection and relief and opportunities. When I think about our own response formed by what we see, our response has to be a Catholic one. We're a group of Jesuits, Catholic priests, and men in formation who formed this program. And so our response is a Catholic one. And we take a lot of inspiration from the words of Pope Francis, who in his encyclical Evangelii Gaudium writes, "I want to say with regret that the worst discrimination which the poor suffer is the lack of spiritual care. The great majority of the poor have a special openness to the faith. They need God, and we must not fail to offer them His friendship, His blessing, His word, the celebration of the sacraments, and a journey of growth and maturity in the faith. Our preferential option for the poor must mainly translate into a privileged and preferential religious care." Maybe some of the phrasing there is familiar to you if you've heard of the preferential option for the poor before. Pope Francis writing about this, it was one of the first times I heard it referred to religious care. When we think about the preferential option for the poor, we have to think about distribution of resources. And there are a lot of needs on the border. There's a lot of need for shelter, for food, for clothing, some of these basic humanitarian needs. And we as an organization, as Del Camino Jesuit Border Ministries, wanted to help provide for some of those. But we identified really quickly one of the things that we could do that no other local NGO here could do was attend to that privilege and preferential religious care. And so in October of last year, we officially named ourselves as Del Camino Jesuit Border Ministries, named after Nuestra Señora del Camino, Spanish for Our Lady of the Way, who's a great devotion of St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits. And of course, we pray for her intercession for all migrants we know who are on the way. And our mission is to offer that privilege and preferential religious care to the poor with a focus on pastoral accompaniment and sacramental ministry with the migrant population on both sides of the U.S. Mexico border. What does that look like? It means we visit camps and shelters, bringing humanitarian aid and celebrating the sacraments. We go to Casa del Migrante and Senda Two on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which are shelters in northern Mexico and Reynosa. We celebrate Mass and we bring humanitarian aid to those shelters. We also visit the Humanitarian Respite Center those afternoons, which is the transit center on the U.S. side of the border in McAllen, run by Catholic Charities, where we again set up and celebrate the sacrament of Mass, giving thanks to God for people who have been released into the country or who have entered with their CBP-1 appointment, that after a long wait are finally entering this new chapter of their lives as they go to reunite with family and sponsors in the United States of America. Sometimes we reunite with people who we'd seen on the Mexican side of the border, like the Nicaraguan family pictured on the left with myself and Flavio and a Jesuit who is visiting us, Eric. Unfortunately, the father is not pictured in that family. As you can see, they've got 5 kids. One of them's kind of hidden behind the boy up front. So the mother was left alone with them because the father had a previous deportation. Even though it had been over 10 years since that deportation, he was held and was not released and was eventually deported back to Nicaragua. The mother is illiterate, unfortunately, and so as she tried to care for her 5 kids alone in the U.S., she eventually had to give up. She just could not adequately care for them. And so she took her kids and returned to Nicaragua, a country that's marked by insecurity, religious persecution, where they've arrested a couple of bishops and many priests. They've expelled religious orders. They've taken over the Jesuit University. Not a safe place for them to be, but they had no other option and had to return there. So but it gives us joy oftentimes to see families who we've known on the Mexican side of the border to finally be able to get a chance to enter the United States. We also visit camps and shelters on the Mexican side of the border. The Matamoros camp is basically closed down, as I mentioned, so we mostly visit the Pumarejo shelter, where people are living in tents underneath some kind of bigger tents next to an old hospital, where my fellow Jesuits, Flavio and Joe, are currently at this moment celebrating Mass and visiting with migrants as we go on Sundays and Wednesdays. We also visit unaccompanied minors here in the U.S. So if you're under 18, you come to the border without a parent or legal guardian, you get placed through the Office of Refugee Resettlement into a center while they verify who you're being released to into the country to make sure it's a safe place for you. So we have kids from those shelters come to our parish on Sundays to join us for Mass. And then we often go and visit the shelters to celebrate Mass inside the shelters with the unaccompanied minors who are staying there to offer them, again, that privileged and preferential religious care. Every migrant has a story. So before I transition to talking about some ways that you can be involved and help out, I just want to share a couple of stories just to kind of humanize the migrant experience for you and what we encounter in the work that we do on a regular basis. So we do mass twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays at Send It To, a shelter in northern Mexico in Reynosa. To call it a shelter is very generous. It's really just a concrete wall built around what used to be two baseball fields. And most of the people there are living in tents. It was like the picture with the big tent where all these people were sleeping underneath the big tent. Now they're not in that. They're living in individual tents, and there's a couple of small houses that are basically just four walls and a tin roof where people are also accommodated and sleeping. So very scarce resources. But we go and visit Mass there. We also bring some humanitarian aid twice a week. Well, in December of last year, well, I guess it was late November last year after one of the masses, Martin, a migrant from Honduras, came up to me and he said, "Hey, Father Brian, we left Honduras kind of in a hurry. It was a little bit urgent." And he explained to me some of the violence and threats that they were getting from the local cartel that kind of impelled their journey forward north, including with his wife and daughter. And he said, we never got to baptize Kayla, and she's almost 3 now, and we still haven't done her baptism. Could we do her baptism here at one of our masses? And I looked at him and I said, I don't know, but sure, let's try to make this happen. And so I talked to some members of the local church there. Sister Soradit, a daughter of charity who works at another shelter, says, yeah, there's a way to do this. We have a father who helps us to register the baptism. I can do the training for the parents. And so we followed all the steps that we needed to. And in December of last year, Kayla was baptized into the Catholic Church. And it was, it's a stark environment. It's not exactly an elegant church or cathedral, but it was a place of real grace. And it was a beautiful moment for me because Kayla is usually just kind of this bubbly personality who kind of runs up with a big smile on her face. But the day of her baptism, as she walked up in her white gown and her veil and everything, she was super timid and shy. She was clinging to her mom's leg. She wouldn't give me a hug or smile at me. She buried her face into her mom. And the moment of the baptism came, and her godmother was the one who's going to hold her over the baptismal font, but she was squirmish. And so the mom had to kind of come over and help out as well. And we poured the water over her, baptizing her in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And as they pulled her up, this huge smile emerged on her face, and she just started looking around at everybody and giggling. And it was such a beautiful sign to me of the grace of the sacrament of baptism. And just to see this transformation of her kind of timid and unsure to this sense of joy and recognizing the beauty of the moment. The other favorite part of mine for that experience was after we finished that baptism and that mass, I had a line of people saying, "Hey, can we baptize my kids? They haven't been baptized yet either." Or how about my like teenagers who haven't gotten their first communion yet? Could we do that? Well, and since then we've done 8 baptisms and 12 first communions at Send It To, a shelter in northern Mexico. All started because Martin came up and asked that question. Another person I'd like to talk about is Luis Camacho. Luis, pictured on the right, is a migrant from Venezuela. He's a lawyer by trade, but because he's in disagreement with the government, maybe people have followed, there were elections in Venezuela, which seemed to support that an opposition candidate to the current president had won the elections, but he discarded all those results and claimed to have won the election. So it's a very tense political situation. And over 7 million Venezuelans had fled the country. Luis came up to the U.S. Mexico border, trying to do things the right way, getting an appointment with the CBP1 app. But as he got to the border in Reynosa, he was kidnapped. He was held for 5 days as his family tried to put together the money to pay for his release. And after 5 days of being held, he was released and ended up at Casa del Migrante, a shelter that we visit in northern Mexico. Luis was the kind of guy who sits front and center at every single mass. He knows all the mass parts. He's responding with a lot of energy and enthusiasm. And he's also one who was always concerned about the care of others. It was not uncommon for us to walk into the shelter at Casa del Migrante and Luis to be the first person to greet us, and not to say, "Hey, I've got this issue. Can you help me out? Can you get me to the U.S.? Can you get me an appointment quicker?" No, he'd say, "I got a couple you need to talk to. This just happened to them. They're having a really hard week. I think it'd just be really good for you to have a conversation, meet with them." He was just so attuned to the needs of other people. And that's what really impressed me about Luis, is that he was not playing the victim card. He was not a pity story. He was looking to move forward, and he was also looking to help other people. Well, after staying in the shelter for about 3 months in October of last year, Luis got his appointment with CBP1. He traveled north and moved to Denver, Colorado, which happens to be my hometown. And just about a month ago, I was in Denver, and Luis and I got coffee together, which is the other picture there. He's got his work permit. He's got a driver's license. He doesn't have a car yet, so he's doing Uber Eats on his bicycle in downtown Denver. He got a job at a restaurant where he works as kind of a bar back, helping between bussing tables and also helping at the bar at a restaurant. And he's trying to get his daughter and his wife and daughter to be able to flee the situation in Venezuela and reunite with him in Denver through a parole program for Venezuelans, which would hopefully, if things go well, help his wife and daughter to avoid having to make the journey overland and risk the kidnapping that Luis himself suffered. So those are just a couple of stories that kind of paint the human picture of migrants that we see on the border. I have a couple more, but I'm gonna skip ahead from these just to point out this map. As I talk about Luis being in Denver, as I talk about kind of the diversity of destinations that people can end up having. This is just a brief map where I kind of put in some arrows of places where we've known migrants to go. And I could actually update it because I've now met migrants who are headed into South Dakota and who live in southern New Mexico. So just to add another couple to this map. So the truth is, migration is not a border issue. There are migrants present in every single one of our communities around the U.S., contributing to our country, working hard and trying to care for their families and get ahead with their kids in our schools and otherwise. So migration is not just a border issue, although the border is often kind of a focus point that we have when we talk about migration. So how can you respond if you want to respond? Well, one thing I always encourage people to do is to see the reality on the border. There's a lot of things that are spoken about the border, and most of them I think are false narratives. And the best way to dispel that isn't to listen to me talk about them, it's to come and visit. So I invite anybody to take advantage of an opportunity to come and see the border and visit. Of course, you can also volunteer locally. Immigration, as I said, is not just a border issue. So look for an organization locally that's working with migrants. You might be in a city even that has a center where unaccompanied minors are. Some of you might already be doing this work if there's an ICE detention facility that you're visiting along with your own prison ministry. So you might already be engaged in this. But if not, there's a lot of ways to look for ways to plug in. That could also include if you're maybe not finding that a lot of resources do it, what could your parish do? Could you talk to your pastor or other members of a parish committee on social justice or immigration issues to try to mobilize and say, what can we do? There are migrants in our community. What are we doing as a church to provide welcome to them, to engage with that population here? So encourage you to find ways to get involved locally. You can also support organizations and migrants. Catholic Charities in the Rio Grande Valley is a great organization run by Sister Norma. Del Camino, of course, we have an Amazon wish list. There are ways for you to give if you visit our website at delcamino.org. It's important to advocate for change. We're in an election year. The border is being heavily talked about. Both political parties are saying we need to secure our border without talking about how are we going to account for migrants who are in situations of real risk and need. But at the end of the day, migrants don't vote, despite what you might hear some politicians say. Migrants don't have a way to vote. Migrants are not voting. And so they're not factored into the political process. In fact, they become an easy group to target and to blame for fear, to create fear and blame for problems in the country exactly for that reason. If you talk negatively about Catholics in the US, that might garner some support from people who are anti-Catholic, but a lot of voting Catholics are going to be really upset about what you're saying. If you speak bad about migrants, if you call them criminals, if you say that they're terrible people, there might be some compassionate people that don't agree with what you have to say, but it doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's going to vote any differently because migrants can't vote for themselves. So I'd encourage you, if the situation of migrants is one that is close to you, to talk to representatives who represent you politically and tell them that you care about immigration reform, that you want to oppose an asylum ban. You think people should be able to seek safety in a country like the United States of America, which has, through its history, been a place that people have come seeking safety. So please find ways to advocate for change on a local and national level. And the last way what you can do in response, this is a shameless plug for our podcast, the Jesuit Border Podcast. We've got seasons 1 through 6 are already out. We're launching season 7 in about 2 weeks. So if you listen to podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other platform, just search for the Jesuit Border Podcast. Give us a like and subscribe and listen to more stories about our ministry on the border and listen to some of the interviews that we do, including with Bishop Flores, Sister Norma Pimentel. Father James Martin did an interview with me and Father Louis at one point. And yeah, we've got Father Tom Green. We'll launch our new episode. He's a provincial of our province. We have Bishop Tyson from the Diocese of Yakima, Washington, which he describes as a border diocese with no border. 75% of the Catholics in his diocese are Mexican. And so there's some great interviews coming up for this season. So I invite you to give us a listen. So with that, I'm gonna close the slideshow. And I know we've had some questions in the chat and that kind of thing. And so I wanted to pause and maybe turn over to George to kind of facilitate our conversation. We still have plenty of time. So I know I kind of barreled through that presentation at times, but I wanted to hit on a lot of main points and then still leave time for us to have a dialogue and for me to respond to any questions you might have.
So, thank you, Brian. And also, there was a recent, wonderful interview in the New Yorker magazine that people might want to. I forget, it was earlier this summer. I don't remember which date exactly, but
That's right. I'll see if I can find the link here quickly and send it and put it in the chat.
So, I mean, I'm glad that you're getting the recognition that you're getting, because I know from my visit, I was so inspired by what you're doing and really how you're living out the Ignatian charism of going to the periphery to be present with the people who are poor and suffering. And again, people, please write in the chat any more questions you have. But one question is, what can people do, or what do people need to do to really prepare themselves to be effective in detention ministry, wherever they are?
Yeah, this is not my area of expertise, but I think it's important for ministry on the border, for ministry in prisons in general, for us to be attentive to what we're bringing into the situation and what we're going to encounter when we get there. And so we need to be attentive to our own trauma and things that we've experienced in our own life and how that might be touched or pressed or prodded through our encounters with people who are carrying their own trauma. So that's something that I think is fundamental to be attentive to. And then we have to be ready to, and willing to listen with a compassionate, empathetic heart to the stories that people have to open up and share. And we have to do so in a way that we don't become callous to it. It's something I'm constantly confronting and dealing with. Now that I've been on the border for over 3 years, stories that are truly traumatic and horrific start to become routine. And I'm talking about stories of kidnapping, physical and sexual violence. And so it's important for me not to go into just another mode of like, yeah, but to really attentively listen to someone who this is their one experience of this deeply traumatic event. And how can I listen to them pastorally, accompany them with attentiveness and kindness and compassion? And how, in the midst of that, can I try to communicate God's love and compassion and accompaniment, which is very difficult, but we have a God who died on a cross for us. And so who walked his own passion. And I think that's part of the importance and impact of the Christian message, is that we have a God of suffering who accompanies us in our own suffering and trauma. And so how can we be that kind, compassionate listening ear, even when we engage in pastoral conversations that for us could convert into routine, but for a person, it's the most important thing that they're sharing, the most intimate thing that they're sharing about their life. So I think that's an important thing for us to be attentive to know, to have some anticipation of the kind of things that we could hear and receive, to have a sense of how we're going to be receiving that from our own place of brokenness and humanity, and how we can provide a compassionate response rooted in our Christian faith.
I'm glad you mentioned the issue of trauma, because I remember certainly some of the stories we heard when we were visiting with you. And the other problem I would say that people would encounter getting into this work is the problem of vicarious traumatization, where when you're around people who've been traumatized, you yourself experience oftentimes the effects of trauma. So how do you and your brothers there take care of yourselves in the face of the kind of stories that you hear on a daily basis?
Yeah, it's important, and everyone, it can function differently. For our community, I mean, for my life personally, and for our community life, prayer is fundamental. I mean, I start and end every day with time in prayer. That's part of my life as a Jesuit and a priest, but obviously available to anybody. And I think that's essential. I couldn't do what I'm doing without regular prayer. I have a spiritual director I meet with about once a month, who I talk about things. So that gives me a chance to kind of voice the most intimate and difficult challenges of my life and of my work and ministry. So those are resources that I think are really important. Daily prayer and reflection and regular spiritual direction, I think, are invaluable resources that any of us can make ourselves available to. I think therapy can be very helpful. It's not something I've taken advantage of, but I think it's something that can be also very useful for people, and should be taken advantage of when necessary and helpful. We as a community, we find ways to recreate together. I think that's really important, both individually and communally. So we do fun events together, and we have TV shows that we watch together. We gather for certain sporting events. We cook meals for each other and share those meals together. We have little jokes about that, and little games that we play about assigning someone a secret ingredient to make in the meal and the other person has to guess it. I mean, just these little things that become kind of a fun part of our daily routine and help lighten what can otherwise be very serious. And then at the same time, we also have common prayer where we gather once a week together, and that creates a space for us to be in prayer together and to share what's on our hearts. And we have a lot of open dialogue and conversation. I think being isolated in this work can often be the case. I mean, if you're a chaplain going to a facility, you might not have that same network. And so it's important to build one. And that could be with other chaplains, even if they go different days and times, to create a space where you can gather once a week or once a month and have a conversation to talk about what you're going through and how you're processing it. I think that can be really helpful. It's meant a lot to me and to each of us, I think, in this community to have a community that we're all in it together. We can share some of the stories, we can share some of the difficulties, and we can talk about it together. I think so things like prayer, spiritual direction, community life, uh, healthy recreation are some of, I think, the key components. For me, exercise is a big part of it. I try to exercise 4 or 5 times a week. That's a huge source of relief. I'm not some super athlete, but I did my first triathlon in May of last year. So I was training with swimming and biking and running. Again, no super athlete. I didn't place or rank or anything, but it was very healthy for me to stick to a routine of doing exercise. And that can be, Flavio, who's in our community, is a walker. He goes for a walk almost every day, goes to a local park and takes a long walk. So things like that, I think, are super helpful techniques and strategies. Now, I'll say all that and say that also part of it can be even just the way we are built, right? I mean, I've seen people who have all the tools that I've said available, and they've come here and they've worked on the border, and within 6 to 12 months, they're asking to move somewhere else. That accompanying people in trauma is just too much. And so I think some of it can actually be just in the way we're wired as people. I don't know if it's how we're raised or how we're born. I don't have the science on it, but if you find yourself doing this and 6 to 12 months later, you just say, I don't know that I can do this. There's no shame in that. There's no problem in that. This is not, I compare it to, I've got my sister-in-law's sister is an ER nurse and works with people in trauma every day. I don't think not every nurse can be an ER nurse. Not every nurse or doctor can work on the oncology ward with children with cancer, right? And so there's nothing wrong with that. And so find ways that you can put your faith into practice and minister to the people of God in ways that don't cause damage or pain to you yourself. And so just say, just to kind of add that too. So some resources, and also just to say, even with all the resources, it might not be the right thing for you, whether that's border ministry, prison ministry, or otherwise.
That's right. I remember you had just completed a triathlon when we came down to visit you.
That's right.
Somebody's asking, what is your advice for engaging in conversation about migration with a human lens, specifically with others who do not have the same lens of dignity as us? I guess, how do you talk to people who don't feel the way we may about people who are on the border, migrants?
Yeah, it's really challenging. The thing that challenges me the most, I mean, for me, I'm happy to even engage in an intellectual level with people because I find that people who are against migrants, who are really concerned about migration, are just filled with fake information. And I have a lot of those tools from my experience of working here, from my knowledge base, to be able to respond to those in kind of reasonable ways. Unfortunately, even offering reasonable answers doesn't necessarily convert hearts. And so, I always try to use those facts and otherwise to kind of get back to a story, to share a human story. But at the end of the day, I really think the best way to convert someone is through encounter. And Pope Francis writes a lot about that, and I'm a big believer in that. So how can you facilitate encounter? How can you get someone to meet a migrant who can share their actual story and talk about it, in your parish community, a friend that you might have? Can you look for and make friends with migrants who are living in your local community and get together for lunch with them and things like that? As you learn and hear their stories and are able to introduce them to people who might have other perspectives, or invite them into your parish community or otherwise, that's what's ultimately going to change hearts, or I invite people to come down to the border, because I think you can't spend time in the shelters in northern Mexico with us celebrating Mass with migrants and leave feeling the same way as you did before, regardless of what your views are in immigration. So I don't have there's no catch-all. In my own approach, I try to combat misinformation with true information. But at the end of the day, to convert a heart, I think you really need encounter. And so that's something that I as an individual can facilitate, but can't myself do. Someone needs to take that step towards encounter themselves to have their heart touched.
This is kind of a two-part question. One is, we've heard a lot in the debates about the immigration reform bill that had been passed it was a bipartisan legislation that had been voted down in Congress. Um, are you aware of how that bill, had it been successful, might have improved the situation or not for people on the border? And also, if time, money, and resources weren't an issue, what would you recommend to improve the border situation and the migrant situation?
Absolutely. Great questions. Regarding the first question, I would say that was a horrible border bill. We were very opposed to it. It was bipartisan, which is really disappointing because it shows how poorly migrants are represented in the national discourse around migration. And an executive order in late June put into place some of the harshest parts of that border bill. And so what it means is it severely penalizes people who enter between ports of entry, often deporting them immediately with a 5-year ban from reentry to the United States, even if they're coming seeking asylum in our country, and really pressuring and forcing people to enter with the CBP1 app. Even though, I mean, that means, we meet Mexican nationals who are fleeing the Mexican drug cartels and are having messages sent to them threatening to murder them and their families, which does happen in the country of Mexico on a regular basis. There's a mayor in southern Mexico, state of Guerrero, just this last week who was decapitated. I'm sorry to be so graphic, but the violence in Mexico is very real. And so you get a Mexican coming up to the shelter saying, look at all these messages. They're looking for me. They're trying to hunt me down and kill me. And we have to say, okay, just download the smartphone app, send in your advance information, and begin to ask for an appointment daily. Oh, by the way, it might take 10 months. I mean, we are putting people and lives at serious risk. What am I supposed to say to that person if they decide to cross the river and say, I can't wait for this appointment. I'm going to cross the river. I'm not trying to sneak in. I'm going to sit on the river on the other side. I'm going to wait for Border Patrol. I'm going to say, please, please, God help me. I've come here, look at this evidence I have. And what our Border Patrol agents are doing is plugging their ears, filing some paperwork, and deporting that person right back to Mexico with a 5-year ban from even legally entering the country. That's all part of this legislation that was proposed and was widely rejected, but then put into place in a large part by an executive order. There are other parts of that bill to strengthen border security and things like that. A lot of it, again, I would say, is we keep investing money, time, resources in infrastructure of exclusion as opposed to infrastructure of welcome. So if time, money, and resources weren't an issue, how would I improve the border? I would open up pathways for legal immigration, including people who, here's part of the problem, is a lot of people are seeking asylum because they're fleeing situations of violence. The problem is asylum law was written after World War II when Nazi Germany was massacring large numbers of people. So it was the state of Germany committing mass atrocities. And so asylum law says if you're fleeing violence or threat of violence by your state, you have a right to asylum. The reality today is that it's mostly non-state actors that are creating the violence, and those are primarily drug cartels, which are often very linked and involved with the state. Just like in Mexico. In northern Mexico, even if a Mexican citizen gets kidnapped, they're not calling the police to report that crime because the police is sharing that same information right back to the cartel. And so it's all closely linked. And yet what we see is a lot of people get their asylum claims rejected because it's the cartel that's the threat of violence and not the state. It's not some uniformed police officer that's coming and threatening to kill you or murdering your brother on your front yard. Again, sorry to be so graphic, but these are real stories of what's happening to people. And so your asylum claim gets rejected because it was the cartel that did it. You should have turned to your state to seek protection from them, even though that's just a completely farcical idea. And so what are pathways to legal migration? I mean, CBP1 is one pathway that's being provided, but all it's granting people is this temporary 2-year parole. And so it's kind of a ticking time bomb for a migrant to say, and what do I do at the end of 2 years? I got to return to the situation of violence. So many of them are applying for asylum, but like I said, are those claims going to be accepted or not? So number one, expand legal pathways for people to come to the country so that they're not incentivized to work with cartels, to sneak into the country, to go undocumented or to cross between ports of entry. And we can do that by building up infrastructure of welcome, as opposed to just spending billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars, building walls, putting up razor wire, hiring more CBP personnel. Why can't we create more centers of welcome that are staging grounds where people can apply for work permits, where people can get reference to low-income housing, where people can find help to get their kids into school, to apply for jobs in places like the agricultural sector, in construction, in cleaning, the kind of jobs that we have a lot of openings in the hospitality sector. When I drive, I don't know about you guys, but when I drive around cities in the United States, I see now hiring signs all over the place. We've got like record levels of unemployment that continue to be sustained. And when I see those, I think, gosh, what a mismatch of resources. I know so many people who could work these jobs and would be willing to do so and be grateful for the security and protection they'd get by being in the United States of America. And yet they're sitting in some shelter on a smartphone app every day, waiting for an appointment. While the restaurant I want to go to has to close early because they don't have staff to staff the evening dinner or whatever, just to kind of highlight some of the absurdities of these. So time and resources, building centers of welcome in big cities around the country and especially along the border that can help migrants to be processed, to be well received and integrated in communities. I think it's a low ask given the billions of dollars we spent again on infrastructure of exclusion. A very insignificant percentage of that. I mean, we're talking about if we gave 5 to 10% of that to infrastructure of welcome, it would be transformative.
You've addressed this to some degree, but given the kind of political discourse we're hearing right now in the election season that demonizes to a great extent people who are seeking asylum, people who are migrants, have you noticed any direct effect on your work as a result of this kind of language being used?
Yeah, I mean, there have been internet provocateurs that have come down and film video trying to cast false narratives. There's been fake information handed out. I mean, there was a fake flyer posted in northern Mexico saying that a local organization was trying to help migrants to get into the United States and remember to vote for a certain political party, and it had the graphics from a nonprofit, and they had not made those flyers, and those went viral. Those were taken onto the floor of Congress, and so that cast a big light on that organization. The Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, has attacked including Catholic organizations doing help for migrants, including Annunciation House based out of El Paso, Sister Norma's Catholic Charities here in the Rio Grande Valley, Team Brownsville, and basically attacked them for their assistance and humanitarian aid provided to migrants. So it hasn't hit as immediately close to home with Camino Jesuit Border Ministries, but a lot of our colleagues have seen that. And I just feel really sympathetic for the migrants. They really don't come into the country realizing how much vitriol there is, how much anti-migrant vitriol there is. It's so funny how different messages get communicated differently. The migrant population has really lowered since the executive order in June. There's really not as many people in migrant camps and shelters in the north of Mexico. I could speak more to those dynamics in a moment, but just to say, and that also means the amount of people arriving at cities like New York and Denver and Chicago has decreased. Governor Abbott has stopped running his buses where he was trying to overwhelm those cities because there's not enough people for him to send on those buses anymore. So he stopped doing it. The point I was going to make there, I kind of sidetracked myself. I lost my train of thought. But some of those cities aren't being as kind of overwhelmed with migrants anymore. And what was the point I was going to make about that? Oh, that's right. So when those cities were getting a large number of migrants, like New York City, headlines in the New York Times and other newspapers were migrant crisis crippling the city. It's going to be the end of New York and it's overwhelmed. When I would talk to migrants, I was like, why are you going to New York City? Because they're like, oh yeah, I mean, I know someone who stayed in a shelter and they got their work permit. So they were in New York City and they got a job. I was like, wow, how different are these narratives? Like what we're seeing, the American populace, what migrants are seeing through their forms of social media and communications is just these completely different narratives. And I think that's true too. They get the stories of kind of the American dream are the ones that go viral about success stories of migrants who are in the US who have work and a place to live and things like that. But the reality is that most migrants, even when they get to the US, face a tremendous amount of barriers. Access to resources is very limited. Affordable housing right now is a national crisis affecting Americans and migrants. Getting legal help if they need it, if they want to stay beyond kind of a 2-year parole, there's not enough pro bono lawyers, much less even paid immigration attorneys to account for migrants who are needing legal counsel and help. So yeah, that's just kind of one thing to say and to highlight is the different forms of communication and then the difficulties that migrants are going to face even as they get into the country.
There's just a couple more questions as we're kind of coming down to the end of our time here. One person wanted to know, are there doctors who volunteer their time to care for those who may need medical care? And I guess the additional question would be, what types of skills are needed for people wanting to get involved in this kind of ministry?
Yeah,
aside
the
from
skills that are needing are our willingness to come to the frontiers and help with this population. You know, it can kind of pull out of you whatever skills you could bring. I mean, if you've got a legal background, terrific. Medical background can be used. Counseling, therapy, all that, very important. Psychosocial trauma response is very, very essential down here. If you're a teacher and you're good with kids, that's great. There's a lot of kids who are going unschooled. You know, if you're waiting 6 to 10 months in a migrant shelter, that might be a whole year. That might be all of fifth grade that you've now missed. And now you've got to start to redevelop the habits of being in school as a 10-year-old after a year spent not being in a classroom. So any skill can be very useful. Doctors Without Borders is present down here. JRM, Global Response. No, I think they closed down. There are a couple of organizations that specifically do medical work down here, but there's always more ways to use someone with medical background. So if any doctor is coming down, doctor, nurse with that kind of background and wants to come and visit, there are plenty of ways for you to plug in and be able to use your skill and background to help vulnerable populations.
I know in your podcasts you cover a lot of material people would be interested in follow up, including, say, the experience of people who were kidnapped and how common that is and what they went through. Can we post your link to your podcast so people can avail themselves of that? We'll also send this out on our website.
Yes, of course. You can find links to everything to learn more about our ministry through that website. And let me see if I can.
Camino.org. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because that will give you ways to sign up for our newsletter, ways to subscribe to the podcast, ways you can donate. But if you want kind of a direct link to get into the episodes, here's a direct link to the Jesuit Border Podcast through Spotify.
Great.
So those are just a couple of links for you to take a look at. And yeah, we tell a lot of stories in our ministry, and yeah, I mean, kidnapping is extremely prevalent, just to mention that. And you know, they kind of set the price based on your country of origin. I mean, it plays just like a market. It's like if you're from Venezuela, they're going to charge you 2,000. If you're from Central America, 3,000. If you're from Cuba, they might charge 5,000 per person. So they treat it like a market, but a lot of them suffer physical and even sexual trauma and violence done to them when they're kidnapped. It's not uncommon, unfortunately. Robbery as well. Often their possessions aren't returned to them, so maybe they have to get a new cell phone if they want to ask for an appointment again. So both robbery and extortion. So really difficult. If they're not able to pay, oftentimes they're made to do some work for the cartel. You can imagine what that might be for a young woman, or obviously it could be different things depending on what the cartel might ask of you. So it's a really tragic situation. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Brian, for your work, for your witness, and for sharing with us what you're doing today. And may God continue to bless the work you're doing. And in closing, Father Brian, I'd like to invite you to close us with a prayer.
Absolutely. Give me just a second here. I got one that I'd love to use. We just had the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, and so which was always the fourth Sunday of September. And so Pope Francis in his message included a prayer reminding us of how we're all foreigners on a journey, and our ultimate destination is not the United States of America. It's eternal rest with God in heaven. And so let's join together in prayer. In the name of the Father and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God, Almighty Father, we are your pilgrim church, journeying towards the kingdom of heaven. We live in our homeland, but as if we were foreigners. Every foreign place is our home, yet every native land is foreign to us. Though we live on earth, our true citizenship is in heaven. Do not let us become possessive of the portion of the world you've given us as a temporary home. Help us to keep walking, together with our migrant brothers and sisters, toward the eternal dwelling you have prepared for us. Open our eyes and our hearts so that every encounter with those in need becomes an encounter with Jesus, your Son and our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so much, Father Brian, and thank you all for joining us today. Please continue to support CPMC and join us for our upcoming programs as well.
Thanks again for the invitation. God bless everyone.